We're delighted for our next session to welcome Reverend Dr. Ernest Lucas. Ernest Lucas is a long-standing friend of Faraday. I think he's spoken at innumerable courses. I seem to be forever emailing him and asking him to come and speak at one of our courses, which is always a testimony to somebody having something to say and saying it well, so you're in for a treat. He actually started life as a biochemist and was a postdoctoral researcher in biochemistry for many years before he left to study theology and trained to be a Baptist minister. Baptist Church is one of the larger non-conformist churches in the UK. But he also then undertook a second PhD in ancient Near Eastern Oriental studies. So he's one of those rare people that has a PhD in science and a PhD in, theology / biblical studies. He spent many years lecturing in biblical studies at the Bristol Baptist College, which trains Baptist ministers, and was vice principal until his retirement. So he does a lot of teaching on science and religion. He's written a book which he'll probably plug himself. It's on the bookstall on reading Genesis, and we're delighted to have you with us, Ernest. He's going to talk on science, the Bible, and human origins.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and it's good to be involved again in a Faraday course. I always enjoy my trips to Cambridge, though I very much support Oxford in a boat race. Science, the Bible, and human origins. When people hear the term the Bible and something to do with creation or origins, their mind almost immediately goes to the opening chapters of Genesis. But the fact is that the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, contains a good number of texts about creation other than those that we find in the opening chapters of Genesis. And I want to start with just a couple of those examples. I hope you'll see why in a few minutes. Here is a passage from Psalm 74. This psalm is a prayer to the God of Israel, because he's the powerful creator, to deliver the nation after some calamitous defeat. And when it talks about creation, it does it in what many people think a rather strange way, because it talks about conflict, a battle between the creator and sea monsters of some kind, one of which is a many-headed monster who's named as Leviathan. If we move from a liturgical text to a wisdom text from the book of Job, this is part of a poem which is extolling the greatness of God as creator. Well, once again, creation is talked about in terms of a conflict involving monsters in the sea. This time the monster is called Rahab, but there's also reference to something called the fleeing serpent. Now, all this was rather puzzling for Old Testament scholars until archaeology came to their help. In the 1930s, a group of French archaeologists began to excavate a site on the north coast of Syria, which nowadays the site is called Ras Shamra. But after they'd been excavating for a while, they realized what they were exploring were the remains of an ancient Canaanite city, which was known from Mesopotamian records as Ugarit. And it was a city that was a major port, a major commercial center, major cultural center in northern Canaan. It was destroyed about 1200 BCE and never rebuilt again. So the remains had been there for over 3,000 years, nearly, by the time they excavated it. And parts of the artifacts that they discovered here were a lot of clay tablets, like the one illustrated, which were inscribed in cuneiform script. Now, cuneiform script was the script used for the Mesopotamian languages, known collectively as Akkadian, with sub-languages as Assyrian and Babylonian. But it became very clear that this script was being used for some other language. It was not used for Akkadian. And fairly quickly it was deciphered and found to be an ancient Canaanite language very closely related to ancient Hebrew. And then there was a lot of excitement when the following text was published, because these texts included stories about the Canaanite gods and goddesses, including some mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, such as El and Baal and Astarte. But there was this text about Baal. He'd been involved in a conflict with some kind of sea monsters. You smote Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. So Leviathan mentioned in Psalm 74, the fleeing serpent mentioned in Job 26 are brought together, and made an end of the wriggling serpent, the tyrant with 7 heads. Well, Leviathan in Psalm 74 has many heads. Here the number is specified. Even more interestingly, this text excited Old Testament scholars because it seemed very, very similar to a text in the prophets. We've had liturgical literature, wisdom literature, now prophetic literature. And Isaiah has this text, on that day, the Lord, which means it's the personal name of the God of Israel, with his cruel and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan the fleeing serpent, Leviathan the twisting serpent, and he'll kill the dragon in the sea. Now, those two texts, I hope you'll agree, are very similar in English translation. If you compare them in the original Ugaritic, which is the name now given for the language of those tablets, if you compare them in the original Ugaritic with Hebrew, they're even more similar than they seem in English translation. What on earth is going on here? Because, as I said, Ugarit was destroyed in 1200 BC. The text of Isaiah comes from, well, at least 600, 700, maybe 800 years later. But it's almost word for word identical. What's going on? Well, clearly there is something deeply embedded in ancient Near Eastern culture that has acted as the link over many, many centuries to preserve this particular way of thinking and speaking about creation. And we get to that link in a way of talking about creation that occurs throughout the ancient Near East and continues indeed down to early Christian times. Herodotus, for instance, is a Babylonian writer just about early Christian times. And it's best known perhaps in the form of a Babylonian story known as Enuma Elish. I haven't time to tell you the whole story. I'll just break it down, just a very brief summary of the start of it. It's the creation story in Babylon, where Marduk, the god of Babylon, is the creator. The first thing he has to do as creator is subdue the forces of chaos. And these forces of chaos are visualized as bizarre monsters in raging waters. And he has to defeat the leader of these monsters, who is called Tiamat. And that word in Babylonian, Tiamat, is philologically related to the word Tahom, which is the word for the great deep in Genesis chapter 1. So there is a link there. Well, Marduk kills Tiamat. He then slices her in half. The Babylonian text says like filleting a fish. And with one half of her body, he makes the flat circle of the earth. And with the other half, he makes the dome of the sky. Now, that way of visualizing creation clearly became deeply embedded in ancient Near Eastern thought throughout the Fertile Crescent, and the Hebrew writers in Psalms, Job, Isaiah, and elsewhere are aware of it and use that imagery to talk about their God as the creator God. What do we draw from this? Well, I think there's an important hermeneutical point to draw from this, using the term hermeneutics, we talked about last night, in the sense of a framework within which you do your exegesis, the framework within which you do your detailed interpretation. I have called it, others call it, the principle of incarnation. The idea of incarnation is very central, as you'll be aware, to Christian theology. We take that verse in John's Gospel. We may have mentioned the Logos already. The word, the Logos, became flesh and lived among us. The Bible in Western Europe for over 1,000 years was read in Latin, and the Latin word for flesh is carne. So for the word becoming flesh is talked about as incarnation. So the word, the message of God, the revelation of God, came in the flesh and lived among us. That, of course, is referring to Jesus. As in Christian theology, the supreme revelation of God, the fullest revelation we have, is in terms of an enfleshed human being. But of course, Jesus was a specific person with a particular ethnicity, a particular gender, living at a particular point in time in a particular form of culture, speaking a particular language. And so Christians talk about the particularity of the incarnation, which means that God's message comes, if you like, dressed in a particular way because of all those particularities. And to understand the message fully, we need to, in a sense, be able to unclothe it from its incarnated dressing, and then, hopefully, to make it relevant to our age, reclothe it in terms of our own culture. And that is part, and always has been part, of the enterprise of Christian hermeneutics. And it doesn't only apply to Jesus, it applies to the whole of the scriptural revelation, because it always comes incarnated. You've had the point that the Christian revelation, the Judeo-Christian revelation, covers over 1,000 years, well more than 1,000 years. And during that time, you get the message from particular prophets in particular historical situations with a message that's honed to that particular historical situation. You have the words of poets, similarly, are incarnated in their situation, or the words of lawyers or history writers, and so on. And we have to take this into account, Christian scholars would say, when we read and interpret the Bible, the whole of it. And that particularly applies when we come to the creation stories. Now, how do we do that? How do we deal with this incarnated revelation? Well, there are a series of, in a sense, simple questions, and always simple to answer, but simple questions that need to be asked when you read any text. And literary specialists would say this doesn't only apply to sacred texts, it applies to all texts. This is a point we made earlier, that in the Christian tradition we have come to say, well, we must read the Bible in one sense like we read any other kind of literature. And we have to apply these questions. For instance, what kind of language is being used in this particular text? In most languages, using that in the sense of an ethnic language, if you like, there is a distinction to be made, roughly speaking, between what we call in English prose and poetry. Poetry is a more patterned form of communication, and it tends to use far more figurative and imagery in its language as compared to prose. And we need to be aware of that. But we also need to be aware there are many different kinds of prose in any language. There are more literal forms of prose, such as might be used, say, by a history writer seeking to describe a particular event that has happened, through to more figurative forms of prose, which might indeed include things like Aesop's fables in Greek about animals and what lessons we can learn from them. So we need to say, what kind of language has been used in this text if I'm to understand it correctly? But then also, what kind of literature is this particular piece of text? Because literary specialists will talk about different genres, different forms of language, which depend upon the kind of communication you are dealing with. At a basic level in libraries we find this. They classify the books into different forms. First of all, fiction and non-fiction, and then different kinds of non-fiction, different kinds of fiction, and so on. And there are different ways of writing within those genres. In any culture, there is a tradition usually about different genres. Take a very simple example. In English, I've mentioned history. Well, there's a history text, if you like, and there are historical novels. I'm fascinated by history because I had very good history teachers at school. I love reading historical novels. But you approach those two types of literature differently because you know they have a different genre about them. The historical novel will hopefully, if the writer's done their homework, have a reliable historical framework, but all the details are imaginative from the mind of the writer. And then there's another question: what's the expected audience? Any good communicator will match what they are saying and the way they say it to their audience. So I won't talk to a group of youngsters, teenagers perhaps in the school youth group, as I would talk if I were giving a paper like this or a seminar in a university. Although they may have the same title, but you would present it very differently according to your audience. And so depth, way of presentation, what you might focus on and so on will all change. And those three questions may help us to answer the fourth one. What's the purpose of this particular text? Because that's important, because that will determine what sort of thing is included, what's left out, and so on. Coming back to my example, a historical textbook, is written primarily to give information about an event. A historical novel, although it gives some information, is primarily written to, in a sense, entertain the reader. There's a very different purpose there in those two kinds of texts, depending on the audience and so on. And then the relevant extra-biblical knowledge. We might say relevant extra-textual knowledge, because any writer assumes common ground with the intended readership. And the problem sometimes for a reader is I don't share that common ground because I come from a different culture. And indeed, I may come from a different culture that's centuries away in time from the original culture. And so if I am to properly understand the communication, what I read, I need to learn all I can about the culture and language and so on, so that I can understand the text more fully. And so these are all important questions. And what I want to move on to now, coming to the Genesis text, is to indicate very briefly that these questions have been in the minds of Christian biblical scholars down through the centuries. They're not new. They're not something forced upon us by trying to reconcile the Bible with science, because all the examples I'm going to give you come before the so-called scientific revolution. These are questions that good biblical scholars have always been aware, because of the principle of incarnation. They've not used that term. I mean, one of them I'm going to refer to, Calvin, would use the term accommodation, the principle of accommodation. You'll see the relevance of that in a moment. But they've been aware of these questions. So I'm going to start with this character, John Calvin, lived in the 16th century, one of the leading Protestant reformers. He wrote a commentary on Genesis, which was published in 1554. And in his discussion of the opening chapters, he answers the question, what kind of language is being used here? And one of his answers is, it's the language of the ordinary person. And he says that when he's commenting on Genesis 1:16, which is where it says, and God created the two great lights, one to rule the day, one to rule the night. Now the word the is there in the Hebrew text. It's not always there in modern English translations, but you'll see in a moment it's important. Clearly he's talking about the sun and the moon. Now why does Calvin make the comment he does, that you've got there? This shows it's been written for the ordinary person. Well, as already been mentioned, in his own culture they still held to the Ptolemaic earth-centered view of the cosmos, but on that basis they had an idea about the relative distance of the moon and Saturn from the earth, and by just looking at the night sky they were aware of the relative brightness of Saturn and the moon. And when they took those two things together, they concluded for Saturn to look as bright as it does, it must be a great deal brighter and probably a great deal bigger than the moon. So according to the natural philosophers, Saturn was a bigger body and a brighter body than the moon. Is that a problem when Genesis 1 says the two great lights? Just two of them, sun and the moon. No, says Calvin. It's not an issue, because Genesis 1 is written for the ordinary person. It's not written for the natural philosopher. And so it doesn't worry him that there seems to be a contradiction in some ways, because he said that's not what the text is concerned to deal with. It's just addressing the ordinary person. In our modern terms, we might say it's the language of the supermarket, not the language of the university lecture theatre. And that leads him to his other comment about the language. It's the language of appearance. It's talking about the night sky, the sky in general, the heavenly bodies, as they appear to the ordinary person. And so he says, nothing is here treated of but the visible form of the world. He who would learn astronomy and other recondite arts, and in the English translation of the time, arts would what we mean technologies probably. He would learn astronomy and other science and technology, go elsewhere. Don't read Genesis 1 to get scientific astronomical information. Now he makes that comment on Genesis 1 verse 8, which is where we're told God created a rakiach, to use the Hebrew word, to separate the waters above the rakiach from the waters below the rakiach. Now the older traditional English translation of that word, as in the King James Authorized Version, is firmament. And that's a good word to translate it, because it implies something solid, something firm. And that's what the Hebrew word, rakiach, implies. Indeed, it implies something made of beaten out metal. So, understood in that way, the Hebrew text is saying God has created the metal dome over us, with the waters above it and the waters below it. In the flood story that comes 6-7 chapters later, we read that there are windows in the rakiach through which come the waters. And so because it's solid, you need to have windows in it to let the water through for us to get rain and so on. That's the cosmological picture that the ordinary person, the ordinary Hebrew, had at that time. And Calvin says you must accept that and not inappropriately try and read scientific information out of the text. Well, let's jump back 1,300 years to an early Christian scholar, Origen, and he is commenting on Genesis 1 at this point in his text. And he says, Genesis 1 has, right at the end here, a semblance of history. It looks like a chronological historical account of creation. But he says, hold on a moment. If you try and read the text as if it were that, you find there are internal contradictions. And these internal contradictions must have been, the writer must have been aware of them, and that tells us the writer is not intending us to read this as a chronological historical text. It's something else. What is it? Well, let's look at the contradictions first. He's saying, on the first 3 days, we are told there's morning and evening. But you don't get the sun and the moon created till day 4. You can't have morning and evening till you've got the sun. And what's more, on day 1 you've got morning and evening, but you haven't got a heaven until day 2. So how can you have morning and evening when you've got no heaven and no sun? Clearly, he says, these are clues in the text to tell us not to read it as a chronological account. It's what he calls a figurative expression, a figurative story, to indicate certain mysteries. And by mysteries, he means theology. He is saying this is a figurative account to teach you theology about creation, and you mustn't read it as if it were a chronological, in quotes, scientific account of creation. That's not what it's intended to be. And that's simply from looking at the text itself with what I would call some sensitivity with regard to literature, and concluding what sort of text we have got here. And a couple of hundred years later, St. Augustine of Hippo, who we've also been introduced to before, he's got his second commentary on Genesis called The Literal Interpretation of Genesis. He makes a comment very similar to the one we've seen from Origen, but this time about Genesis chapter 2. And here he's referring to the account in Genesis 2 of God creating Adam from the dust or the clay of the earth. So the implication is God creates a human form out of clay and then animates it, breathes into the nostrils. And the Hebrew word that's used for form, yatzar, is the word that's used in the Old Testament, for instance, for the work of a potter or the work of a sculptor forming something. And so Augustine says, does this mean we must believe that God's got bodily hands, that he can shape clay in the way a potter shapes clay? He says, that's a childish way of thinking. Clearly what's here is a metaphor. This is a form of figurative language. It's picture language, picturing God as something like a potter. Because God doesn't have a material body with arms like we do, so don't read it as a literal account in that sense. It's interesting, I mean, when Augustine says literal interpretation of Genesis, he means interpreting it as literature in its right literary form. And here the text itself, taken in the context of Judeo-Christian theology about the nature of God, indicates it's to be taken as a figurative form of literature. And that's how you should read it. I've got another comment from Augustine, which in fact brings together the two ideas of language and literature, but I put it here because he is not just talking about Genesis, although it's from his commentary of Genesis, he's making a comment about the Bible in general. He says, perhaps sacred scripture in its customary style is speaking with the limitations of human language in addressing men of limited understanding. And this is where the idea of accommodation comes from. God accommodates the form of his revelation to a way that's understandable to us humans with our limitations of our languages and the limitations of our understanding. And he says this is customary in the Bible. It's not limited to the opening chapters. It's customary in the Bible. This is how God reveals it. So this is an important way of understanding the Christian hermeneutic, right down from Origen onwards, the way they have approached understanding the biblical text. You must be aware of the different kinds of literature and interpret each appropriately. Well, what audience? This is the easiest question to answer. The Genesis text was originally intended for ancient Hebrews who lived in the ancient Near East. Now that's very important if you adopt the principle of incarnation, because we now know a good number of ancient Near Eastern creation stories. And by looking at those stories, two scholars, Collins and Clifford, and A-N-E here means Ancient Near Eastern, they have compared the, if you like, the commonalities in the different ancient Near Eastern creation stories with the modern scientific creation story. And they make a number of important points. Ancient Near Eastern writers, they say, imagine and present divine action on the model of human making. Well, we've seen that. Genesis 1 presents God as I would say, as an artisan doing a planned and structured and ordered week's work. So in the first 3 days, there are acts of separation, and then the next 3 days, there are acts of filling the forms that have been made. And at the end of each day, the worker looks at it and says, that's a good day's work. And at the end, looks and says, well, that's a smashing week's work, and has a day's rest. So there's the story form of a worker doing a week's rest, partly to say it's planned, it's ordered, it's thought through, but also to give us the pattern of 6 days' work and a day's rest and worship. And then chapter 2, we have the idea of, as I said, the potter or the sculptor forming Adam. So the model of human making is the imagery that is used. Whereas scientists regard creation as the impersonal action of physical forces. They say ancient Near Eastern accounts focus on the emergence of human society. That's their importance. Genesis 1, where does it lead? It leads to the creation of humans who are to rule and subdue the creation and their role that they are to have as those made in the image and likeness of God. So that's the focus of the story. Genesis 2, where does that lead? It leads to the institution of marriage, which is seen as, by the ancient Hebrews as the bedrock of human society. Genesis chapter 3, what does that say to us? Its main message is human society is now disordered. And it's somewhat chaotic. So that's the focus, human society and its nature. Whereas, for scientists, the important thing is the emergence of the physical world. Yes, humans are part of it, but they're seen as part of the physical world. Just a small part. And then, ancient Near Eastern texts present creation as a drama, a story. I hope you'd agree if you read them. Genesis 1 is a dramatic story. Genesis 2 and 3 perhaps is an even more dramatic story. That's what they are stories, dramatic stories. Whereas science gives us the account of an unfolding impersonal law-governed process. It's a wonderful process, but it's not quite the same as the sort of dramatic story that you read in the biblical and other ancient Near Eastern creation stories. The criterion of truth for ancient Near Eastern accounts is functional. Does the story enable me to cope with some aspect of life now? We see that from the way we see the stories being used in the different cultures. And if you want to come back to that point in question time, we can. Whereas for scientists, the criterion is, does it explain all of the scientific data satisfactorily? That's the concern. Well, where does this lead us with regards to the question about the purpose of creation stories? This is a well-known quote. People often attribute it to Galileo. Well, Galileo did write it down in his self-defense letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, but he makes clear he's in fact quoting a leading theologian of the Roman Catholic Church at the time, Cardinal Baronius. And Cardinal Baronius said in the Bible, the intention of the Holy Spirit, the one who inspired the scriptures, is to teach us how one goes to heaven, not how heaven goes. In other words, it's to teach us what in Christian theology is called soteriology, the theology of salvation. It's not there to teach us cosmology or astronomy. And so there's this recognition. If only the other leading theologians of the Catholic Church at the time had accepted that, there wouldn't have been the confrontation with Galileo that there was. This is falling apart in my hand. Let me put it back together again. Right. Well, what he says in Galileo, in fact, refers back to St. Augustine of Hippo in that very same letter, where Augustine says something very interesting. He's saying, in fact, as you'll see there, that people were saying to him, and he's saying to other Christian scholars, well, what does your scriptures tell you about the material heaven? The context makes clear that here he's talking about the material heaven, not the spiritual heavens. And he says, the sacred writers, in their deeper wisdom, have omitted anything about the material heavens, or enters very little, the Spirit of God who spoke through them did not wish to teach men these facts that would be of no avail to their salvation. So he's again making the point that Baronius made, and Baronius may in fact be quoted him, I don't know, more or less. He is saying the scriptures aren't there to teach us about the material heavens, about astronomy, cosmology, science. They're there to teach us about salvation, about our relationship with God and how we put that right. But when we come to the Genesis stories themselves in their original context, I think we can say pretty clearly that they present, from a Hebrew point of view, the true theological understanding of the nature and purpose of creation in contrast to the ideas of Israel's neighbours. There are particular points in the text where this comes out very clearly. I haven't time to go through all three of them. I'll just take the first one because we referred to that text before. This is the one about the two great lights. When it says the two great lights, the Hebrew text uses a word for light that is the common word for any self-luminous object, such as an oil lamp. So it is saying the Creator put two great oil lamps in the sky, as well as a number of others, the stars. Why doesn't it say he created the sun and the moon? Because there are perfectly good Hebrew words for sun and moon that are used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. Well, biblical scholars suggest the reason is that in most of the Semitic languages of which Hebrews are part, the words for sun and moon are in fact the names of gods and goddesses. And they are heavenly bodies which you must fear and worship and serve. The Hebrew text is just subverting that. It's a polemical attack on that. Oh no, they're just big oil lamps. They're not there for you to worship and serve. In fact, the text says they're there to serve you, that word is used, by marking out days and seasons and months. So you don't serve them, they serve you. It is not about astronomy. This is about astrology. It's a polemical attack on astrology. That's what the text is about. It needs to be read that way, not as an astronomical text. So I haven't time to look at the other two. If you want to come back to them in question time, we can. On extra biblical evidence, Calvin's very clear about this in what is the nearest thing to his systematic theology, his Institutes of the Christian Religion. And he says here, he's making a statement here, which I might need to explain the background a bit. After the disobedience of humans, what's happened to the image of God in humans? Well, it's still there, but it's marred. But Calvin believed it's not eradicated. The fact we still bear the image of God, though in a marred form, means we can discover some truth about God from studying God's world. But he said, if we have an honest seeker after truth, they will discover truth, but only because the Spirit of God enables them to do that. This is part of his so-called doctrine of common grace, that any honest seeker of truth is helped by the Spirit of God to discover the truth about the physical world and other things outside the Bible. Of course, we need the Spirit of God to understand the Bible correctly as well, he would say. But the importance of this is it leads Calvin to recognize that Christian scholars must listen to non-Christian scholars. And he says that quite explicitly a little bit later on. So if the truth comes to us from non-Christian scholars, we must accept it and take it into account in our biblical interpretation. Otherwise, we may be offending the Spirit of God. And there is something here that's very closely related to the two books. Because there is the book of God's works, which even non-Christians can study to some degree. And so the truths they discover about that book, we Christian scholars must take seriously, he is saying, when we come to read the book of God's Word. And that's to be an important part of our hermeneutic. So to sum up what I've said so far, I would say the purpose of the Bible in Christian traditions, not all Christians at all times have accepted this, but there is a constant tradition from at least from the 3rd century onwards to say that the purpose of the Bible is not to answer scientific questions about the origins of the cosmos and the mechanisms that are at work in it. It is to reveal the meaning and purpose of what God has created, including the nature of humans and the role that humans have in this purpose. I want to finish by talking a little bit about that, humans. I've been asked to talk about human origins and science as well as the Bible. Well, what do the creational stories say about humans and their purpose? I want to start with this comment from Professor Walton, who's a leading Old Testament scholar and also a leading expert in ancient Near Eastern culture. And he's really expanding on the point that Clifford and Collins made about the creation stories being primarily concerned about the emergence of human society. And he's making an important point here, that in the ancient Near Eastern world, people believed something existed not by virtue of its material properties, which is what scientists are concerned about, but by virtue of it having a function in an ordered system in relation to human society and culture. Now, that's a very important insight because it helps us understand what happens on the first 3 days of creation in Genesis 1. What happens there? I said they're acts of separation, and they're marked off from the acts of filling that the next 3 days give. The first day separates light and darkness. Well, that is the time system. That's the foundation of the time system. That our sense of time comes from, to begin with, the 24-hour cycle of light and dark. And so we are put into an environment where we have a sense of time, a time system. The second day separates the waters above the Archaic from those below it, and as we've seen, we discover later that the wind, the rain, the snow and so on come through windows in the Archaic. This is the weather system. Here is an organized system that's important for human existence on this planet, the weather system. On the third day, we get the separation of the waters from the dry land, and on the dry land are the plants. Well, that's the agricultural system, which is essential for us to exist. It's the plants, as we understand it now, it's the plants that take the energy from the sun and turn it into foodstuff for us, whether we eat the foodstuff directly by eating the plants, whether we eat it indirectly through eating other animals that eat the plants. But here is the agricultural system. So this is saying that the Creator has given an environment fit for humans, centering on those three organized systems. Now, the word that's used in the Hebrew story is good. The Creator looks at each day and says, that was good. In English, we tend to give that word good a strongly moral meaning, good as compared with evil. But the Hebrew word that's used, tov, although it can be used that way, it can also be used of aesthetic beauty, by far its greatest use in Hebrew is best summed up by the phrase fit for purpose. Something is tov when it is fit for purpose. And so this is saying the creation is fit for the purpose the Creator has for it, which is that it should be the home of human beings made in the image and likeness of God. Well, what else are we told about the nature of humans? We are told that we are made in the image and likeness of God. We are made as sexual beings, and the implication of the text at the end of Genesis 1 is both male and female are made in the image and likeness of God. And in that text, and even more so perhaps in chapter 2, we find we are like other creatures, because in Genesis 2, it's not only Adam who's made from the dust of the earth, so are the other animals. They are made from the dust of the earth also, and animated by the Creator. So we are like the other creatures, but we are unlike the other creatures, because we alone are made in the image and likeness of God. Now, what does that mean? Well, oceans of ink have been spilt on that question down through the centuries of Christian theology. There's a considerable consensus today, particularly amongst biblical scholars, that we do best to understand it in terms of the significance of statues of rulers in the ancient Near East. There's a very interesting statue of a ruler. It's discovered in northern Syria. It comes from the 8th century BCE. It's a ruler by the name of Hadadezer. And this statue has a portrayal of Hadadezer, and underneath it there's a bilingual text, both in Akkadian and in Aramaic. Akkadian, Mesopotamian language, Aramaic at that time was quite a widespread language in the southern part of the Fertile Crescent. It's related to Hebrew. And the text below the depiction of the ruler says, this is the image and likeness of Hadadezer. And in Aramaic, the nouns image and likeness are the cognate nouns in Aramaic of the two nouns that are used in Genesis 1, 26 to 28. So Genesis 1, 26 to 28 is, in a sense, picturing humans, or deploying humans as a statue, if you like, of the Creator. That humans are the representation of the ruler of the universe to the rest of creation on planet Earth. And what was the purpose of these statues? Well, to say, I am the one who rules you, first of all. This is what I look like. No television in those days, so it had to have a statue. And then, this is how you are to behave in my realm. That's the bilingual text. This is how you are to behave. So humans are there to show the rest of creation what God is like, and also to help the rest of creation to behave in the way God wants it to. And that, I think, is how we should understand the word subdue. It's not something oppressive, it is how do you live in the way your Creator intends you to. Now, in the discussions down the centuries of what image and likeness means, there have been three main ways of approaching it, and I think they all illuminate the statue idea. First of all, there's the functional understanding, which says, well, we understand what it means to be image and likeness by what we have to do. Well, what do we have to do? We rule and we subdue. And you've seen that the statue is there to say, this is how you are to live in my realm. That's what the text on the statue is about. So humans are there to enable the rest of creation to live in the way the Creator intends it to live, to give a harmonious community, not just of humans, but of all creatures. But then there's the relational understanding that says, this is saying there's a special relationship between humans and the Creator, because we alone are made in the image and likeness of God. We can have a deeper, more meaningful relationship with the Creator than any other creature. But that's important. If you are to be the representation of the Creator to the rest of creation, you must live in a close relationship with that Creator so that you can portray that Creator to the rest of creation. And that leads to the third approach, the structural understanding. But what is it about human beings that means we can do that? Now, as we've said, in biblical tradition, Judeo-Christian tradition, God is non-material, God is spirit, so the image must be something non-material. It's not to do with our physical structure, it must be something to do with what we call, personality. It's to do with the non-material part of us, that in our personality we must be able to reflect something of the divine nature, reflect something of the divine attributes like wisdom, as Creator God creates with wisdom, justice, compassion, above all love. And so it's these things that image God, and indeed in the New Testament that is spelled out, particularly in John's epistles, that it's as we show love that we show God to the world. And so that's the image and the likeness. Now this point has been, some Christian scholars have tried to make this point by saying that the biblical definition, if you like, of human, they talk about that as homo divinus, humans reflecting the nature of God, which is to do with the non-material aspect of humans, and this is not the same as homo sapiens. We are not to confuse homo sapiens with homo divinus. Scientists can only study the material. They study material bone structures and tell us a story about how Homo sapiens has come into being by a seemingly continuous process from primate to hominins, and within the hominins different Homo species, till we have Homo sapiens, which is you and me. That's a material story told on the basis of bone structures. Later on, very later on, you can include material culture here as a way of defining Homo sapiens. And if you want to relate the two, Homo divinus and Homo sapiens, perhaps we can begin to do that when we start to talk about evidence that Homo sapiens shows a sense of the transcendent, shows evidence of worshipping a transcendent being. At that point, we can start to have a conversation about image and likeness. Again, I'm not going to expand on that. You can pick that up in questions. It's very controversial as to when you can do that. But I want to say two other even more controversial things before I end. My way to begin to try and relate the evolutionary story to the biblical understanding of human beings, and I want to do that through the concept of emergent properties. In 1977, this man, Ilya Prigogine, a chemist, was given the Nobel Prize in chemistry for his work on what he called dissipative structures. Now, he had shown that in certain systems, fairly complex systems, if they're open to the environment and they can have a flow of energy and matter through them, you sometimes get fixed patterns occurring. And he called those dissipative structures. And some of them cannot be predicted from the bits, if you like. Traditionally, science has worked by taking complex things apart, studying the bits, and then conceptually putting the bits together and thinking, now we understand the whole. And what Prigogine says, you can't always do that. There are some wholes that cannot be explained by their parts. And he called these emergent properties. Well, much more recently, 1998, Robert Laughlin was given the Nobel Prize for his work on superconductivity. And in his Nobel Prize lecture, he puts quite strongly the point that at the heart of superconductivity is a system called Cooper pairs, which is a pair of electrons. I don't know anything about it, so don't ask me about it, but I'm going on his authority. He says Cooper pairs are an emergent property. They could not have been predicted, and they cannot be understood by just looking at the complexity of the metal lattice in which they come into being. They are an emergent property that can't be explained by the parts. Arthur Peacock, a biophysicist, argued that the genetic code is an emergent property. Yes, it depends upon the physics and chemistry of the four bases, as they're called, from which DNA is made, but from DNA itself, from its physics and chemistry, you could not predict the genetic code. The genetic code only makes sense in a more complex system of the living cell. Even the simplest living cell is a complex system. And when that happens, you get an emergent property, the genetic code, which cannot be explained fully just by the physics and chemistry of the bits. And then we get to the even more controversial thing, what's called downward causation. Because I've said science has traditionally worked with an upward causation. The bits determine the behavior of the whole. But if you get emergent properties, and they're increasingly accepted within science, you find that the whole determines the parts. You get downward causation happening. Now, I want to suggest that this might help us understand the emergence of Homo divinus. An even more controversial area of science nowadays is the study of consciousness, but there are a minority of scientists working on consciousness who argue that the only way, all the evidence is pointing to the fact that human consciousness is an emergent property. It can't be explained by the bits, simply by the connection of neurons and all the rest of it within the brain. They're essential for it to happen, but when you get a sufficiently complex central nervous system, you get an emergent property that we call consciousness. And to begin with, that's I'm conscious of myself. But then I become conscious of the other, of you. There are other beings with whom I can relate, and so on. And then maybe we get another kind of consciousness, which is the consciousness of the holy other. And by that I mean W-H-O-L-L-Y, which also in theistic tradition becomes H-O-L-Y, other, a sense that there is a being who is beyond, who is of a different kind from me. And at that point, I think, is where the biblical story kicks in, because it is saying the holy other has contacted you. The holy other confronts you, and you must decide how you're going to respond. Is it going to be a response of acceptance and obedience to live according to your Creator, or is it going to be one of ignoring or rejecting? And the biblical story says we live in a disrupted creation because we have chosen to break that relationship, not to accept it, but to break that relationship with the Creator, to go our own way, to be our own gods. And as a result, three other vital relationships are affected. There's the relationship of the individual with her or himself. Adam and Eve have a sense of guilt. And we all know there are times when we can't live with ourselves because of what we've said or done. That's the root of our psychological problems. But then it breaks our relationship with other humans. Adam blames Eve and God. The woman you gave me, she led me astray. That's the root of our sociological problems. We can't get on with one another. And then it breaks the relationship with the non-human creation that humans are meant to be imaging God to and helping to live in a godlike way. That's the root of our ecological problems. It seems to me there's a very profound diagnosis of the human condition here in Genesis chapter 3. And we're going back thousands of years. Well, Genesis 3 tells us, and indeed the rest of the Bible, continuing from Genesis 3, tells us that God's purpose now is to restore humans to that intimate relationship with their Creator and to bring harmony to the created order. And it just hints at the fact that humans may have a role in this. And when it says, I will put enmity between you, that's the woman, and the serpent, the source of evil, and the woman will put between you, the serpent, and the source of evil, and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, he will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. So somehow humans are going to play a part in soteriology, God's plan of salvation. So, to conclude, just expand my previous summary. The purpose of the Bible is not to answer scientific questions about the origins of cosmos, including the humans and the mechanisms that work in it. It's to reveal the meaning and purpose of what God has created, including the nature of humans and the role that humans have in God's purpose. And I would argue that's been a continuous Christian tradition for nearly 2,000 years.
So we've got time for some questions. And Rachel's got her microphone again. Up here. With,
just building on your conclusion, I would say that we always say that the scripture, and in the case of Islam, the Quran, is a book of science, not a book of science. So it is a book of science, not a book of science. So he doesn't have to answer each single bit in science. So it is not a scientific book, but it is rather a book of science, of the existence of Almighty God.
That's interesting, because that's parallel in many ways. Yes.
Yeah. I'm curious to know the geographical area of the ancient Far Near East.
When I talk about ancient Near East, I am talking about the area from, shall we say, Persia in the east through to Egypt, with the what's called the Fertile Crescent being that area around the eastern end of the Mediterranean, which is fertile because either of the great rivers at the great ends or because of the rain that's brought in off the Mediterranean. So that's the area. So it include, yes, modern Middle East, but it would be including Turkey. Yeah, the Hittites, for instance, seem to have a somewhat similar creation story, and they were in central Turkey.
Bruno?
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I might be asking too much, but are you saying that Adam and Eve in this model are archetypes of the human condition? When these stories were told and shared in the first listeners, how, because I'm a Western, thousands of years later, being influenced by different interpretations of, and thank goodness we have so much material and others to reinterpret as well, but how do you reconcile these archetype aspects of the historicity of evil here? So I just want to understand, for me, it's just clarification, or maybe what is the sense of Adam and Eve, archetypical figures of humanity?
That's very much an open question, I think, and much debated amongst Christian scholars. Do look at Dennis Alexander's book, Evolution and Creation. But do we have to choose? Yeah, you have to choose. Because in his chapter there on the biblical material, he sets forth a number of different, what he calls models. I think there are different ways of seeking to relate the biblical story to the scientific story. Some would want to posit an historical Adam and Eve, and that, it seems to me that makes sense. So I think I'd probably think in terms of small community in which the sense of consciousness reaches the point where they're aware of the transcendent and respond. Others would take it, as you say, using the word archetype, and there are those Christian scholars, even quite conservative Christian scholars like John Walton, who will use that term. They are archetypes. They are presenting the nature of human. So there's a span of Christian ideas of how you relate it to the scientific story to the biblical text.
But yet the model seems to be comprise both spectrums, and it's very helpful, the model that you presented, to understand human condition in relation to history and our responsibility. I think you're right. I'd want to say you get the same theological conclusions, whichever end of the spectrum you take with models, you get the same theological conclusions.
Right at the very back, then forward to Roy, is it? And then to the front here.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated your idea of approaching Scripture through this generosity of reading, based on the principles of reincarnation and accommodation, as you put them. I was wondering if you could give me a little bit of a taste of this reading when applied to the book of Job, in particular, the different interpretations that take place in that story. Job's interpretation of his pain, and the three miserable companions, as he put them, their interpretation of Job, and then finally their rebuke by God. Or maybe this is asking too much.
It would take another lecture or more. I'm not an expert on the Book of Job, though I haven't sort of made study of Hebrew wisdom literature in general part of my research, and have written commentaries on the other wisdom books, but not Job. I think probably all I can say about that is, let me try and put it this way. The Job story, although it's unique, and I think it's the prime supreme example of something we find in ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature, which is grappling with this issue of why do the innocent suffer. I would say I'm not hung up about the question as to whether it's a historical story. I mean, there is a story at the beginning and the end about Job, but the important thing about it is we have got, I would say, an inspired thinker here who is trying to grapple with this issue, and with there's a tendency in wisdom to be black and white, partly because at the root of wisdom is proverbs. And a proverb is a black and white saying. It has to be, because it's a very brief saying. Too many cooks spoil the broth. But of course we also say in English, many hands make light work. And those two seem to contradict each other. But you have to know the right situation. So the three miserable friends are concretizing one aspect of wisdom teaching about suffering and saying, it's the wicked who suffer, so you must be wicked. And what the Book of Job is doing is blowing that apart and say, no, here is a genuinely righteous man. He may not be perfect, but a genuinely righteous man, and yet he suffers. And he cannot fully understand why. And he never fully understands why, but we do as the readers, because we're told the background to the story. This is a spiritual battle. He is part of that and caught up in it. For him, the only resolution is he ends up feeling, although in the middle of it he feels God has forgotten him, God has misused him, God has abused him, but at the end of it he comes back to trust in God. You know, he now trusts in God, so his faith. So I'd say that's basically how I'd approach the story.
I think Roy had a question, and then Mohammed here.
Yeah, you mentioned towards the end of your talk, I forget what you called it, but it was the idea of consciousness not being something that you can actually explain scientifically, but it is something that comes as a result of the sort of
very complex central nervous system.
Very complex central nervous system and the interaction of neurons and so on. But it seems to me that isn't there a danger in that if that is what you're using to justify this business about the image of God and the relationship with God and so on and so forth, is yes, undoubtedly the human brain functions in a much more complex way than those of other animals, but that is in a sense a question of degree. And at what point do you regard that degree as sufficient to create what you call consciousness, which you can then use to sort of justify the idea of the image of God and what you then went on to talk about?
Yeah, I'm not trying to justify it, I'm trying to illuminate. Let me put it that way. It may not be a helpful illumination in the end. What I'm saying is there are a minority of researchers in the consciousness area of science who are saying, we think we know enough now to say consciousness is best thought of as an emergent property, which we cannot explain fully just by the bits, by the organization of neurons and so on. They may be wrong, but that's what they are saying, some of them. There's precursor to that, which I think is quite interesting, in the work of Stephen Penrose, who was originally a quantum physicist but moved into consciousness research. Professor Ewan Squires, who I happen to know because he was my church treasurer in Durham, a mathematician in origin, who both pointed out that there is a potential weakness in the traditional scientific approach, particularly as we see it in artificial intelligence research and so on, that assumes that intelligence and therefore consciousness ultimately is a thoroughly, what's the term I want, you can have an algorithm, because AI has to work on algorithms, mathematical procedures, which are there in all our computers and so on. But Stephen Penrose, Ewan Squires, and some Nobel Prize winners in brain studies have pointed out that Gödel's theorems knock that away. I'm not a mathematician, I'm not a philosopher, but Gödel's theorems were saying mathematics is an incomplete system. Once you've got a slightly complex mathematical system, it's incomplete. What they mean by that is it has to rest on assumptions that cannot be proved from within the system. Now, people like Bertrand Russell, who spent part of his career trying to prove that wasn't the case, very annoyed about that. But Gödel seems to have proved it. And what's the point of that? Well, it's saying that I think that's a precursor to the idea of emergent properties. There is something about consciousness that cannot be explained by the bits, by the algorithms that you put into your computer and so on. That just seems to me that's interesting and may be significant. Consciousness research is such an early stage that we can't say much more than that. But they are saying that therefore, you know, we have to accept, as we have in chemistry without problems, in physics without problems, that there are emergent systems that can't be explained by the bits, because that's where the science leads us. So why not in consciousness research?
Did you still have a question, Mohammed? And then, no, here first, and then Kent, and then Hafia.
Thank you very much for the fascinating talk. My question is with regards to what St. Augustus mentioned, that it's about how one goes to heaven, not how the heaven goes.
Mm-hmm.
So is that correct to say that science is fundamentally concerned about physics, the physical world, or we can call it physics, and religion is fundamentally concerned about metaphysics? So the way we look at metaphysics is very different to the way metaphysics, by definition, you can't observe. So is it correct to go back to the Professor John Gould? Is it John Gould? No, Stephen Gould's.
NOMA, yes.
Yes.
Non-overlapping magisterium.
Yeah. So is that a correct way of understanding? And then if that is correct, then what is the basis of the discussion between science and religion? Is there any basis?
Well, yeah, I don't think that, I'm not an expert on Augustine. I don't think he is saying that. I think what he is saying in the quote I gave is very specifically Scripture is not concerned about informing us about the physical world. I don't think, I think he's very wary, although he, as James told us earlier, he did tend to tie his own reading of Scripture to the natural philosophy of his day. He does say, I can't remember whether it's in his commentary or one of the other writings, you must not tie your understanding of the Bible too closely to the current natural philosophy, because if the natural philosophy changes, and he's aware it can do, that will make the Bible look silly. So you've got to try to relate. I mean, biblical scholars, and I'm sure the same will be true with Islamic scholars, are always wanting to relate their theology to their own generation, and to do that we have to have some kind of correspondence, and I reject the NOMA principle, no overlapping mysteria. They do overlap, but they overlap in a very fuzzy way, and we have to be very careful. And if we do believe the world is created by the Creator, there is something about the Creator that we can determine from the world, and so on. But how we relate it, we've got to be very humble, I think, to use a word that Templeton likes very much. We have to be very humble about how we do it, and recognize that we are always working with a limited understanding of our scriptures and a limited understanding of the natural world. But if we believe that is God's created world, there will be something to be learned by putting the two together in certain ways. But we must do it very tentatively and humbly. I'm not sure whether either Calvin or Augustine would put it that way, but that's up to them.
Follow it up afterwards, but we've got so many hands up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Just now you mentioned how to explain our human being from the function, relation, construction, and so forth. But after I listened to your speech, but I find perhaps there another interpretation of human being, such as event, contradiction, paradox. For example, in your explanation, we can find, for example, our human being's value is whole, is totality. But we live in reality. We have pain, we have suffering, and so forth. But at that time, in the reality, you can feel, we are individual. Yeah, but while we sit or stand in front of a God, we feel God perhaps full of imagination. So at that time, that's a contradict. My meaning is, if we have the philosophy of event or contradiction to understand the human being, perhaps we have another perspective of understanding the God. Even nowadays, God, we can from many hypotheses aspect to understand God. Perhaps the God is out of the product of our imagination and reality. So nowadays, the God perhaps have many aspects, so not the whole. So my meaning is, even the God is full of contradict. That's my question. Yeah, thank you.
Well, it's a very good comment as well as question. And yeah, all I was trying to do was to very briefly and simplistically draw lines that have been Christian ways of approaching the issue. Those three. You're quite right. There are other ways, and particularly with our modern understanding. But I would want to say that what you say about contradiction, I mean, that is there in the Hebrew scriptures. Job is an example of that, which is challenging in some ways one particular rather ossified, fixed way of understanding the human-God relationship. So that's perfectly right, and is there in the Psalms, perhaps particularly in some of the Psalms, where the psalmist is crying out to God and saying, I just don't understand what you're doing, it's unfair. You know, I do trust you, but how can I trust you because of this? So yes, what you've raised is very important, and I think particularly it has come out perhaps more in modern Christian theology than it did in earlier theology. Those who are grappling with that sort of thing. Perhaps existentialism, for instance, as a philosophy, challenged Christians to look at that in a new way.
Great. Halfia, you had a question.
I'd like to pick up again on the consciousness science. The way you explain consciousness, I think I thought was reverse of what I understand by consciousness development. I'm just trying to find my note, but from your, oh yes, there we are. You start with consciousness of yourself, and then others, and then a wholly other deity. But I understand consciousness as developing quite differently from that. From a Sufi persuasion, and the child is born aware of God according to the teachings, and only after it gets aware of other people does it start losing that consciousness and forgetting about it. It's still there somewhere, but it doesn't remember it. And the first thing that child develops is a consciousness of other people rather than itself, because it develops consciousness of its mother and its mother's face and its mother's other attributes, her smell and everything else. And then after that, it might start to develop more, or it starts to develop more consciousness of its body and its limbs, and starts exploring all that. So that's the other way around. And you just said, yes, you said science is explaining consciousness in terms of the complications of the human brain and the neurons and the neuron networks. But all animals have neuron networks, and in the Quran it says that all animals are aware of God and worship Him in ways that we don't understand. So I don't see how that can distinguish us from animals, really.
There's a nest of questions there, all of which are very important. I'll just try and say two or three things briefly. I'm not an expert at all in consciousness research. I'm going to make that very clear. What you have said about the child is what I read also in work, but that's done on human development as it is now, how the human child develops now. And there's got a lot of research done, for instance, in Oxford about young children seeming to have this sense of God from right to start. Yes, that's how we are now. What I was talking about is what's hypothesized about development of the species of Homo sapiens. And when you begin to get evidence of some self-consciousness, and then particularly some people would argue in art, cave art and so on, a sense of the other, and then when you get evidence from roughly about 10,000 BC of worship structures that seem to be intended for worship. So that's the if you like, the the development of the species as compared to the development of the individual now. I think that's an important distinction to make. Now, you said something towards the end that's now gone from my mind that I wanted to comment on. What were you saying right at the neurons? Yeah. So what coming? Oh, about animals. Yes. Yep. There's a very good volume. I'm trying to remember the title of it. I know that Malcolm Jeeves is the editor. Professor Malcolm Jeeves is the editor. There's one of his books there, but this is a very recent book in which a group of experts from a variety of fields discuss this issue of the relationship of animal to human, and where do you put a dividing line if you do put one. Yes, there are animals, non-human creatures, that show a sense of individuality. They can recognize themselves. Certain birds, if they're given a mirror, they can recognize themselves in that mirror. Other animals are totally diffused by a mirror. They go around the back to see what is there, and so on. And it doesn't surprise me at all, as a Christian, that traits that are essential to our humanity appear in attenuated forms in non-human creatures. I'd expect that, really, in one sense, if I believe that God has created through a process. And you can say the same in terms of social behavior of animals and so on. So there is a continuity. Whether and where you draw a line, you'll find current scholars are divided. Something you can draw a line, something you can't draw a line. To me, it doesn't matter very much, but I was saying there is a spectrum, and at the end of it, you have us, who have an awareness of the divine, awareness of the transcendent. And the Bible implies, okay, it's largely in the poetic literature, the Bible implies that the rest of creation can respond to God. You know, it may be just the imagination of the, I shouldn't say just, the imagination of the poet can say, you know, that the trees can clap their hands and the animals can praise the Lord. And I'm sure that's true, that there is a relationship between God and every creature that God has created. And in some sense, that relationship is there. We cannot understand how, you know, it works, so to speak, but it is there, and I certainly want to say that.
And actually, if I could just add a footnote to that verse on trees clapping their hands, which I've written about. Actually, there's a couple of books been published recently talking about the language of trees and how the young trees do better when they are planted close to the parent tree, because there seems to be some symbiotic communication between their root systems. So it's really very innovative research. I'm just reading a book about it at the moment, but which suggests that perhaps the ancient writers of Psalms like that had a bit of better clue of what was going on somehow, that there was some intrinsic property of sort of kind of not non-animal nature that in some ways is more responsive than we think. I think we're going to stop now, actually, because we...
Can I say two things?
Yes, you may.
You mentioned, I won't say much for a moment, my book is there for you to look at, but if you want to push further on the scientific side of relating things to the biblical story, there is a paper of which I was the lead author, which is published in this excellent journal, Science and Christian Belief, and it's a paper entitled The Bible, Science and Human Origins, and some of my talk is taken from that paper. I think there's something unique about that paper in that it's it's something very unusual in the humanities and in biblical study of theology. It's a multi-author paper, and we brought together a group of an Old Testament scholar, myself, a New Testament scholar, Anthony Thistleton, and then 5 or 6 scientists from very different areas of science. And for 2 or 3 years, we dialogued together about understanding the scientific story and then how do we relate it to the biblical story, and we ended up producing this paper. So if you want to follow up a particular relationship to the science and more about the science, do get hold of a copy of Science and Christian Belief and read the paper. It'd be great if you subscribe to the journal, but there may be other ways of getting hold of the paper.
What year is that?
It's 2006, October 2006.
Okay,
It's very recent.
Okay, well, let's thank Ernest for a very interesting and stimulating talk.